There's a phenomenon I've observed over decades of watching people make financial decisions. Some of the worst retirement planning mistakes come wrapped in language that sounds sophisticated and prudent. People make these moves thinking they're being smart about money, and they're actually undermining their financial security in ways they won't realize until it's too late to fix. I spent an evening with a man in his late 60s a few years ago who'd made most of these mistakes. He'd done everything that financial media and well-meaning friends told him sounded smart. He'd paid off his mortgage aggressively. He'd kept enormous cash reserves for safety. He'd hired expensive advisors to actively manage his portfolio. He'd invested in annuities for guaranteed income. And despite 40 years of decent earnings and what he thought was careful planning, he was facing retirement with far less than he needed. Let me walk through 7 moves that sound smart but actually keep you broke. If you're making these choices, you might feel like you're being responsible and prudent, but you're probably sabotaging your retirement without realizing it. Move 1, paying off your mortgage at the expense of retirement contributions. This sounds wise on the surface. Debt is bad, right? Being debt-free gives you security. And there's certainly psychological peace that comes with owning your home outright. But the math often doesn't support making this a priority over retirement savings, especially if you've got a low-rate mortgage. I knew a couple who made this their mission in their 40s and 50s. They had a mortgage at 3.75%, and they poured every extra dollar into paying it off. They succeeded, paid off their house by age 60, but during those years, they were only contributing enough to their 401k to get the company match, maybe $8,000 annually combined. They could have been contributing $30,000 or $40,000, but chose mortgage payoff instead. Here's what that decision cost them. Let's say they put an extra $25,000 per year toward the mortgage for 15 years instead of into retirement accounts. They saved maybe $55,000 in interest over the life of the loan by paying it off early. Not nothing, but let's compare if they put that $25,000 annually into retirement accounts instead, earning reasonable market returns over those 15 years, and then continuing to grow until they retired at 65, that would have been worth somewhere around $600,000. They traded $600,000 in retirement assets for $55,000 in interest savings and the psychological benefit of owning their home free and clear. Now, they own their house, but they're facing retirement with inadequate savings. Their monthly expenses in retirement are lower because they don't have a mortgage payment. That's true. But they need to live on about $2,800 a month from Social Security because their retirement savings are so limited. If they'd kept the mortgage and built proper retirement savings, they'd have the mortgage payment, but they'd also have 4 or 5 times as much invested, generating income that would more than cover that payment. The smart sounding advice was pay off your mortgage, be debt free. The actually smart move for most people is max out retirement contributions first, especially when mortgage rates are low, then pay off the mortgage if there's money left over. The tax advantage compound growth of retirement savings almost always beats the interest savings from early mortgage payoff. Move 2, keeping huge cash reserves because you're worried about emergencies or market crashes. This sounds prudent. You need emergency savings. Everyone tells you that. And cash feels safe, especially when the market gets volatile. So people accumulate 6 months of expenses, then a year, then 2 years in savings accounts, earning minimal interest. They feel responsible and prepared, but large cash holdings destroy wealth through inflation. If you've got $50,000 sitting in a savings account earning 2% while inflation runs at 3%, you're losing 1% of purchasing power annually. Over 20 years, that $50,000 loses about $10,000 in real value, just sitting there, supposedly safe. I watched someone keep $200,000 in cash for over a decade because he was worried about market volatility and wanted to be prepared for anything. That $200,000 earned maybe $24,000 in interest over that decade. Sounds okay until you realize inflation ate away about $60,000 of purchasing power, a net loss of $36,000 in real terms. If he'd kept $25,000 in cash for genuine emergencies and invested the other $175,000 in a balanced portfolio, that would have grown to probably $350,000 or more, even with market ups and downs. He cost himself roughly $200,000 by keeping too much in cash out of fear. The smart sounding advice was keep lots of cash for safety. The actually smart move is keep 3 to 6 months of expenses in cash for emergencies, maybe a bit more if you're approaching retirement. But invest everything else. Cash is not safety when inflation is eating it. Real safety comes from assets that maintain purchasing power over time. Move 3, hiring expensive advisors to actively manage your investments. This sounds sophisticated. You're getting professional expertise, someone watching your money full time, using strategies you don't understand. Surely that's worth paying for, right? You wouldn't do your own surgery. Why do your own investing? The problem is that most active management, even by professionals, doesn't beat simple low-cost index funds after fees. And the fees are substantial. And an advisor charging 1% of assets plus putting you in funds that charge another 1% in fees, that's 2% annually. On a $500,000 portfolio, that's $10,000 per year you're paying. I knew a man who worked with a prestigious wealth management firm for 20 years. They charged 1.25% of assets under management. They put him in actively managed funds with average expense ratios of about 0.9%. Total cost was over 2% annually. On his portfolio that grew from $200,000 to $600,000 over that period, he paid somewhere around $200,000 in cumulative fees. His returns over those 20 years were about 5.5% annually after fees. A simple low-cost index portfolio over the same period returned about 7.5% with fees of maybe 0.1%. If he'd gone the simple route, his $200,000 would have grown to about $850,000 instead of $600,000. The expensive advice cost him about $250,000. But it felt smart at the time. He was working with professionals, getting quarterly reports, having strategy meetings. It all seemed sophisticated. In reality, he was paying a fortune to underperform a strategy he could have implemented himself in an afternoon. The smart-sounding advice was hire professionals to manage your money. The actually smart move for most people is learn enough to manage a simple portfolio yourself or use a low-cost advisor for a one-time planning session, then implement with index funds, save the 2% annually in fees, and let that compound for decades. It's worth hundreds of thousands. Move 4, investing in annuities for guaranteed income. This sounds secure. An insurance company promises you monthly income for life. No matter how long you live, the checks keep coming. That guarantee feels valuable, especially when you're worried about outliving your money. But annuities are expensive products with high fees, surrender charges, and opportunity costs. The insurance company isn't giving you free guarantees. They're charging for them through reduced returns and restricted access to your money. I watched a couple in their early 60s put $400,000 into a variable annuity. They were promised guaranteed income of about $22,000 annually starting at age 70. Sounds reasonable until you run the numbers. Over the next 25 years, they'd receive about $550,000 in payments, assuming they both lived to 85. But they gave up $400,000 today to get that. If they'd invested that $400,000 in a balanced portfolio instead and withdrawn 5% annually, they'd have taken about $500,000 over those same 25 years while still having over $300,000 remaining in principal, growing over time. They'd have similar cash flow plus retained capital and flexibility. The annuity locked up their money, charged high internal fees, and gave them less total benefit than simple investing would have provided while taking away all flexibility. If they had a health emergency and needed money, too bad, huge surrender charges. If they died early, their heirs got much less than they would have with the invested portfolio. The smart sounding advice was buy annuities for guaranteed income. The actually smart move is usually to invest appropriately, maintain flexibility, and manage withdrawals yourself or with a low-cost advisor's help. The guarantees of annuities sound comforting, but they're expensive and inflexible in ways that often work against you. Move 5, avoiding stocks in retirement because they're too risky. This sounds prudent for retirees. You spent your life accumulating. Now you need to preserve. Stocks are volatile. You're on a fixed income. Better to stick with bonds and cash where things are stable, right? Wrong. Retirement potentially lasts 30 years or more. If you're 65, you might live to 95. You need growth to maintain purchasing power over 3 decades. An all-bond portfolio will slowly lose to inflation, leaving you with diminishing real income as you age. I knew someone who retired at 65 with $900,000. He immediately moved everything to bonds and cash because he'd been taught that retirees shouldn't take stock market risk. His portfolio generated about $35,000 annually in income. combined with Social Security. He was comfortable. 20 years later, at 85, he was stressed about money. His portfolio still had about $800,000 in it. He'd barely touched principal. But $35,000 doesn't buy what it used to. With even modest inflation of 2.5% annually, his purchasing power had been cut nearly in half. His actual living costs had risen to about $60,000 annually, but his portfolio was still only generating $35,000. He was eating into principal rapidly. If he'd kept even 50% in stocks, his portfolio would have grown to probably $1.5 million over those 20 years, even with withdrawals. The income from that larger portfolio would have kept pace with inflation. Instead, his fear of stock volatility guaranteed the slow erosion of his purchasing power. The smart-sounding advice was avoid stocks in retirement. The actually smart move is maintain significant stock exposure, maybe 50 to 60% depending on your situation, to ensure your portfolio can grow faster than inflation over a potentially 30-year retirement. Stocks are not riskier than bonds for long-term money. Inflation is the risk, and stocks protect against it better. Move 6, claiming Social Security at 62 because you don't want to leave money on the table. This sounds logical. You've paid into Social Security your whole life. Why wait to collect? What if you die at 68 and you spent all those years not collecting? Better to take it as soon as you can. But for most people, delaying Social Security significantly increases lifetime benefits. Every year you wait from 62 to 70, your benefit goes up substantially, about 8% per year after your full retirement age. Someone whose full retirement age benefit is $30,000 would get about $21,000 claiming at 62, or about $37,000 claiming at 70. I knew a man who claimed at 62 because he wanted the money immediately. His benefit was $24,000 annually. He lived to 88. Over 26 years, he collected about $624,000 total. His friend with an identical work history waited until 70 to claim. Benefit was $34,000 annually. Lived to 87. Over 17 years, he collected about $578,000. Wait, that's less? Yes, because he collected fewer years. But here's what matters. The second person had to fund those 8 years from 62 to 70 from savings. That cost roughly $240,000 from his portfolio. So first person collected $624,000. Second person collected $578,000, but spent $240,000 from savings to wait. That seems about equal, right? Not quite. The second person's portfolio had less withdrawn and more time to grow. His ending portfolio value was about $400,000 more than the first person's because of reduced withdrawals during those 8 waiting years. Plus, the higher Social Security meant less pressure on his portfolio thereafter. Total lifetime resources available were significantly higher for the person who delayed. And if either had lived to 95, the delayed claimer would be way ahead because that higher monthly benefit compounds over decades. The smart-sounding advice was claim early, don't leave money on the table. The actually smart move for many people is delay as long as possible, especially if you're healthy and have longevity in your family. The higher benefit for life is usually worth more than the earlier, smaller payments. Move 7, trying to minimize taxes in retirement by taking minimum distributions and living frugally. This sounds wise. Keep your income low, stay in low tax brackets, minimize what goes to taxes, be efficient, defer distributions as long as possible, live on as little as possible to preserve capital. But this strategy can backfire badly. If you defer too much, you end up with enormous required minimum distributions in your 70s that push you into high brackets. You might pay more in taxes over your lifetime by deferring than you would have by taking larger distributions earlier at lower rates. I watched a couple do this. They had $2 million in traditional IRAs, were living almost entirely on Social Security in their late 60s and early 70s, taking minimal distributions to keep income low, very tax efficient year to year. They felt smart about minimizing their tax bill. Then they hit 73 and required minimum distributions kicked in. They had to start withdrawing about $75,000 annually from their IRAs. Combined with Social Security, that pushed them into higher brackets. Worse, at 85, when they really needed money for health expenses, their RMDs were huge because the accounts had grown so much. They were in higher brackets than they'd ever been paying 22 or even 24% federal tax plus state taxes on those forced distributions. If they'd been more strategic, taking larger distributions in their late 60s and early 70s when they were in lower brackets, maybe doing some Roth conversions, they'd have paid tax at 15% and had more flexibility later. They'd have paid significantly less in total lifetime taxes and had more spendable money. The smart sounding advice was minimize distributions, defer taxes as long as possible. The actually smart move is often to be strategic about distributions and consider Roth conversions when you're in lower brackets, even if it means paying some tax earlier. Total lifetime taxes matter more than any single year's taxes. Here's what connects all 7 of these moves. They sound prudent, they sound like what responsible people should do, but they optimize for the wrong things. Paying off the mortgage optimizes for debt-free feelings rather than wealth accumulation. Keeping huge cash reserves optimizes for false security rather than purchasing power. Expensive advisors optimize for feeling sophisticated rather than actual returns. Annuities optimize for guarantees rather than flexibility and total returns. Avoiding stocks optimizes for avoiding volatility rather than maintaining purchasing power. Claiming Social Security early optimizes for immediate income rather than lifetime value. Minimizing current taxes optimizes for annual efficiency rather than lifetime tax burden. All of these moves prioritize feeling smart or secure over being actually wealthy and secure. And that distinction matters enormously over decades. When I finished explaining this to that man in his late 60s, he was quiet for a long time. He'd made at least 5 of these 7 mistakes. Paid off his mortgage early while undersaving for retirement. Kept too much in cash. Worked with an expensive advisor, bought an annuity, claimed Social Security at 62. He'd done everything that sounded smart and responsible, and he was facing retirement without enough money. He asked me what he should do now. Honestly, his options were limited. He couldn't undo decades of decisions. What I told him was to at least stop making the mistakes going forward. Don't keep accumulating cash. Invest what he has more appropriately, even at his age. Don't buy more annuities or insurance products. Think carefully before making any more supposedly smart moves that actually work against him. But mostly, I told him to share his story with his kids and friends who are younger and still have time to avoid these mistakes. Because these moves sound smart, they get repeated generation after generation. Someone hears you should pay off your mortgage. So they do. Never running the numbers. Someone hears you need lots of cash for emergencies, so they accumulate it, never considering the inflation cost. Someone hears professionals are better than doing it yourself, so they pay high fees, never comparing returns. These myths persist because they sound right, because they appeal to our desire for security and sophistication. But they're wealth destroyers nonetheless, and the cost only becomes clear decades later when it's too late to change course. So if you're making any of these 7 moves, stop and reconsider. Run the actual numbers. Compare what sounds smart to what is smart. Because financial security in retirement doesn't come from following advice that sounds prudent. It comes from making choices that actually build and preserve wealth, even if those choices seem less sophisticated or less secure on the surface. The couple who kept the mortgage and maximized retirement savings outperformed the couple who paid it off early. The person with moderate cash reserves outperforms the person with huge cash holdings. The index investor outperforms the person with expensive advisors. The person who delays Social Security outperforms the early claimer. The retiree with stock exposure maintains purchasing power better than the all-bond retie. The strategic tax planner pays less lifetime tax than the annual tax minimizer. What sounds smart and what is smart are often different things. And in retirement planning, that difference compounds over decades into hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars of different outcomes. Make sure you're choosing substance over the appearance of prudence, results over the feeling of sophistication. That's what will actually keep you secure, not broke, in retirement.